The rain didn't ask for permission. It just came slow and cold, soaking through the thin black fabric of my coat, as if it were reaching for my bones. I didn't move, not even when someone offered me an umbrella. My eyes stayed fixed on the casket, that wooden box that now held the only man who ever really saw me. The pastor's voice blurred into the sound of water tapping leaves and puddles forming at our feet. My hands were folded tightly in front of me like a child trying to behave. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't broken, but because the grief had formed something deeper, a quiet, still lake inside me. And when I looked up, finally, I saw her, my daughter, standing 2 rows behind under a bright umbrella, not touching her husband's hand, not even looking at the grave. Her eyes were on her phone. I waited for her to look up. She didn't. It was the sort of moment where time bends a little. You want to tap it, freeze it, rewind, and play it again to make sure you weren't just imagining things. But I wasn't. She didn't cry. Not for him. Not for the man who carried her on his shoulders to the fair, who fixed her first car with his own 2 hands, who built her a desk for her college dorm when we couldn't afford to buy one. I remembered all of it as I watched her thumb move across that screen, like she was ordering coffee instead of saying goodbye to her father. And in that moment, something shifted. I don't mean a big explosive shift, not rage or screaming. It was more like the creak of a door beginning to close. The others were there, of course. My nieces and cousins and the neighborhood women who always brought too much potato salad to the potluck. Some of them cried. Some pretended to, but most of them just looked uncomfortable. Death does that. It rearranges people, puts them into strange shapes. And me, I just stood still, listening for something. Maybe his voice, maybe mine. Maybe just the sound of my own heart deciding it was done, waiting for things to fix themselves. When the ceremony ended, people didn't linger. They scattered like dry leaves in wind, each with a place to be a text, to reply to a brunch to finish. My daughter walked toward me at last, but her steps were hesitant, like she was approaching someone she owed money to. She gave me a quick hug, dry and shallow, and said, "You held up well, Mom," as if that were something to be proud of, as if I'd rehearsed for it. Then she was gone. Again pulled into a knot of friends I didn't recognize, all of them dressed like a fashion shoot, gone somber. I waited for everyone to leave, I always do. I like to be the last one. The silence afterward is sacred. The way the graveyard empties and the sky stops pretending. That's when you can hear the real things, the crows, the distant traffic, the small voice inside that says, "This is the beginning of something else." I bent down and pressed my hand against the earth, still loose, not yet settled. I whispered something only the soil could hear. Not a prayer, more like a goodbye from one silence to another. I stayed there until the caretaker politely cleared his throat from a distance, reminding me that the world still turned and there were gates to be locked. Driving home, I didn't play music. I didn't call anyone. I just let the road stretch out like a gray ribbon pulling me toward a house that now felt like a museum. Every streetlight flickered in and out of the windshield like it was blinking at me. I felt detached, like I had shed something at the graveside, something I couldn't name yet. The house greeted me with its usual creaks and sighs. It was never quiet. It had too many memories embedded in its walls. I opened the door and stepped inside, and for a moment I half expected to see him in his chair, slippers half off, book in his lap. But of course he wasn't. There was just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of his aftershave lingering in the hallway, like a ghost that hadn't figured out it was time to go. I didn't take off my coat. I walked through the house as is like a guest visiting my own past. The pictures on the walls looked unfamiliar in this new quiet. The frame with our wedding photo had dust on it. I don't know how long I stared at it long enough to realize how young we once were, how full of hope, how unaware of how much a daughter could change, and how alone you can feel in a full house. Eventually I sat down. Not in his chair, I couldn't. Not yet. I chose the kitchen stool instead, the one closest to the window. I watched the rain soften against the glass, watched the garden blur into shadows. I stayed like that for hours, not crying, not thinking, just listening to what the house had to say. And it said something I didn't want to hear but needed to. You're not home anymore. The next morning I walked into my own kitchen and felt like I had stepped into someone else's life. The scent of yesterday's coffee still lingered faintly, mixing with the floral detergent someone had used to wipe the countertops, someone, but not me. I didn't remember giving anyone permission to clean. But then again, funerals have a way of inviting strangers in through the back door. My sister-in-law must have taken the liberty. She always did love playing hostess in a house that was never hers. There were new teacups on the rack, delicate porcelain with painted blue vines, and a note on the fridge that read, "We left food in the fridge for later. Don't worry about anything." I stared at that heart-shaped scribble until it blurred. It wasn't the note that bothered me. It was the fact that they thought I needed it. I walked around slowly touching surfaces, like I was trying to remember what they used to feel like. My hands lingered on the oak dining table. The polish was still tacky in some spots. I imagined her standing there, my daughter giving orders, pointing at napkins, moving plates, pretending she knew this home. I wondered if she remembered that table was where she learned to tie her shoes, where she once cried over a math test where she announced her first pregnancy in a burst of tears and laughter. But yesterday she had moved around it like it was a showroom, set her fingers trailing across the edge, not with nostalgia, but with ownership. I opened the fridge. It was full of neatly packed containers labeled with sticky notes, quiche from Melanie chicken soup, from Kathy vegan curry, just in case. I closed it again. I wasn't hungry. Not for food, anyway. I stood in the center of the kitchen listening. It was quiet. Too quiet for a house that had once echoed with a man's deep laugh, the clinking of glassware, the buzz of old music on a Sunday morning. I found my way into the living room and sat at the edge of the sofa, and that's when I heard it. Her voice. From upstairs. She was on the phone. "No, Mom's doing fine," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "I mean, she's old, but she's holding up. I'll take over things soon. Dad didn't leave behind a mess, so that's a blessing. We'll sort out the house stuff next week." She paused, then chuckled softly. "Yes, of course I'll keep the piano. It's antique. Might be worth something." I didn't move. My hands were folded in my lap, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I knew she didn't know I was listening. That was the only grace in that moment. Because if she had known, if she'd looked me in the eye and said those things out loud, I think I might have broken right there on the carpet. But she didn't. She thought I was fragile, invisible, someone to plan around, not with. And the strange thing was, I wasn't even surprised. She came downstairs a little while later, cheerful and airy like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek too quick, like a clock punching time. "Morning." "Mom," she said. "Do you want me to make you breakfast?" I said. No. I didn't want anything from her hands that morning. I watched her move around the kitchen, my kitchen pulling open drawers, searching for the skillet. She didn't know where it was. Had to open 3 before she found it. And when she did, she said, "You should reorganize these. Everything's in such odd places." I didn't respond, just sipped my tea and looked past her out the window. She made scrambled eggs, burnt them slightly, and served them with toast that was too dry. I thanked her anyway. She smiled like she'd earned a gold star. "I'll take care of things okay," she said. "Don't worry about the estate. I've already talked to someone about valuations. You should really think about downsizing. You don't need this much space anymore." Her voice was syrupy, but it carried a current beneath it, one that pulled away every layer of comfort I had. I looked at her then, really looked, and I realized I didn't know the woman sitting across from me. I saw her face, yes, my daughter's face, but I didn't see my daughter in her. I saw a woman hungry for control, moving pieces around a chessboard she hadn't earned, and suddenly I remembered something years ago my husband once told me: watch how people behave when something ends. That's when the masks come off. At the time, I thought he was talking about work or politics, but maybe he was talking about family. All along. She cleared the plates, humming a song I didn't recognize. Then she walked into the hallway and began chatting with her husband in low tones. I didn't strain to listen. I didn't have to. The walls in this house were thin enough to carry disappointment. The house that he and I had built brick by brick, weekend by weekend, now felt like a stage set for someone else's play, and I was the old prop in the corner, no longer needed in the scene. I stayed quiet that morning. I didn't shout. I didn't weep. I simply folded a napkin in my lap and began to wonder when my name had started to sound like a burden to her. I wondered if there had been a moment, an actual moment, when I'd stopped being her mother and started being her obstacle. The house was still full of guests by midday, people I hadn't seen in years, friends of hers, distant cousins. One of them asked if she could have a look at the attic. Another complimented the potential of the backyard. Someone even joked about how it wouldn't take much to modernize the kitchen. I just smiled and nodded, and every nod was another nail in the coffin of what used to be my home. By nightfall, I had only one thought left. I don't think I belong here anymore. She was standing in the doorway of my bedroom when I saw her next. My daughter. One hand on the frame, the other holding her phone again. Always. That phone like a second mouth. I hadn't invited her in, but the door was cracked open, and in this new version of my life that seemed to be all the invitation anyone needed. "Just looking for the charger," she said casually, though her eyes were scanning the room in a way I knew too well. Like a guest at an estate sale, measuring value, not memories. The charger sat plainly on the nightstand. She picked it up, but didn't leave. Instead, her eyes drifted to the tall mahogany dresser in the corner, the one my husband built by hand when we were still young enough to laugh at splinters. Her gaze lingered just a beat, too long, and I felt it like a breeze across the back of my neck. She looked at me and said, "You've still got all your jewelry in here, right?" It wasn't a question, it was an opener, a wedge. I didn't answer. I just folded the sweater I had been holding and placed it gently in the drawer. I hoped my silence would be enough to close the subject, but it wasn't. It's just, she went on, "Some of the pieces are quite old. They might be fragile, or maybe better stored somewhere safe." That's when I turned to face her fully. "They're safe where they are," I said, calm, measured, but she didn't flinch. She smiled like she was trying to appear helpful. "Well, we can catalog them at least, just so nothing gets, misplaced." Catalog, misplaced. Such clinical words for heirlooms that once marked anniversaries, childbirths, recoveries from surgeries, reconciliations after fights. The brooch he gave me when we had nothing but a one-bedroom and a shared dream. The pearls from our 25th, each one representing a year he held me through. But she didn't see that. To her, they were lines in a spreadsheet waiting to be sorted. Later that afternoon, when I went back into the bedroom, the top drawer of the dresser was slightly ajar. I never leave it that way. My hands trembled as I opened it fully. Nothing was missing, not exactly, but everything had been touched. The careful arrangement I kept the lace handkerchiefs, the little velvet boxes, was disturbed, like someone had rifled through a sacred text and left the pages dog-eared and bruised. I sat down at the foot of the bed. The quilt beneath me was worn thin at the edges, stitched with colors chosen long ago. I ran my hands over it as if I could press the house back into its old shape. But it was already warping, slipping through my fingers like warm wax. I wasn't grieving just my husband anymore. I was mourning the shape of my family, the way it had quietly shifted into something colder, more transactional. That evening she came in again. No knock, just presence. "Hey," she said, "do you want me to help sort the closets tomorrow? I know you probably don't need half this stuff anymore." She gestured vaguely at the space around us like it was clutter and not the curated memory of decades. "We could donate the rest. Someone out there probably needs it more." And I looked at her, my daughter, the girl I once rocked in a chair during thunder, the woman who now saw my past as excess. And I realized something with terrible clarity. She wasn't asking. She was clearing space, not for me, for herself. I nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then," I said. But that night I took a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, not out of fear, out of reverence, because some things weren't meant to be handled like second-hand goods. In the quiet, I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the box he had made for me, carved with initials lined with soft fabric. Inside were letters, dozens of them, from him, from before we were even married. I read 3 of them by lamplight. His handwriting was steady, full of hope. One day, one letter read, "I hope our daughter will see how much we built with so little." I closed the box slowly. I wasn't sure she ever would. When I returned it to the drawer, I felt something harden inside me. Not bitterness, not yet, but resolve, a quiet fortification of the heart. I would not argue. I would not plead. But I would not let her repurpose me into a relic, because I wasn't done yet. The morning sun filtered in through the lace curtains, that kind of soft, golden light that used to feel like comfort. But today it only revealed how much dust had settled on the surfaces of my life. I woke early, not because I had slept well, I hadn't, but because something inside me kept ticking, like a clock wound too tight. I moved through the house in slippers, touching familiar things, the edge of the bookshelf, the knob of the hallway closet, the photo of him on the wall, our wedding day, black and white, his hand on my waist like I was made of glass. Downstairs, I could already hear voices. My daughter's was the loudest, floating from the living room, where she sat with her husband and a family friend I barely knew. The television was on muted. They were speaking over coffee and pastries someone must have brought. I stayed on the stairs for a while, just out of sight, listening. "She's going to need help keeping up," my daughter was saying. "There's no way she can handle all this. The bills, the property taxes. Honestly, I'm surprised Dad didn't make more arrangements." "She's lucky to have you," the friend murmured. My daughter laughed, light dismissive. "Well, I do what I can. I'm the only one really stepping up." It wasn't even what she said. It was how easily it came, like I was already an account to be managed, a problem to be solved, not a person, not the woman who raised her. I turned away and went back upstairs. I needed air. Out in the garden, I found the rose bush he had planted for me on our 30th anniversary. It had bloomed that summer like a promise. Deep red petals, stubborn even in drought. I crouched next to it, ran my fingers along the stem. A single bloom was still hanging on the last one. I pinched it gently and brought it to my face. The scent made my chest ache. From the corner of my eye, I saw her standing on the patio, arms crossed. "You should think about moving into one of those senior communities," she said, like we were continuing a conversation I had never agreed to start. "It's safer, less work. They have transportation and everything. You could even make some friends." I turned to her slowly, and what would happen to this house? She blinked, caught off guard that I was willing to name it. Well, we could sell it, or rent it out. I mean, if you really want. We could keep it in the family, but you don't use most of the rooms anymore. Rooms, that's what she saw. Not the nursery we painted mint green and filled with lullabies. Not the dining room where he carved the turkey every Thanksgiving. His hands steady even when his knees were failing. Just rooms, empty space she didn't want to see wasted. I use them all, I said quietly. Maybe not with my hands, but I use them. She sighed and stepped down into the yard. You know I'm trying to help, right? I nodded. I know that's what you think you're doing. She went back inside and I stayed in the garden until the sun climbed too high and the light got sharp around the edges. That afternoon I walked into the guest bedroom, the one where she and her husband were staying, and found papers spread out on the bed, a tablet open with browser tabs, estate sales, probate liquidation tax exemptions. My name was at the top of one of the documents. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough to understand they were planning for a future I hadn't consented to, a future where I was already gone. I sat in the corner chair and stared at the neatly arranged pile of documents, wondering how long she had been preparing this. Before the funeral, before the illness, maybe even longer. That evening she brought wine to the table, poured herself a full glass, and only half of one for me. We'll toast to Dad, she said, raising her glass, and to the future. To Dad I agreed, but I didn't drink. She took a long sip and smiled. I've been thinking, maybe we could start cleaning out the attic this weekend. There's so much up there. Most of it's probably just old junk, right? I held her gaze. You always did like to clear space before thinking about what was in it. Her face shifted just for a moment, a flicker of annoyance behind the practiced smile. I'm just being practical. You always told me to be strong and practical. I told you to be kind first, I said, then practical. She didn't respond. She just turned her eyes to her plate as if the silence between us was too loud to meet head on. After dinner I washed the dishes alone. She had offered, but not sincerely. Her footsteps faded up the stairs while I stood in the kitchen letting my hands move through warm water and soap, one plate at a time, just like always. Only now every clink felt like a goodbye to a world slipping away. And by the time I turned off the faucet, I had made a decision, a quiet, slow decision that didn't need fanfare or drama. They would not have this house. They would not have the rest of my life wrapped in paperwork and pleasantries and pre-cut good intentions. I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel, and I smiled just a little. The sound of drawers being opened pulled me from sleep the next morning, not frantic, not loud, just methodical, polite almost. I rose slowly, joints stiff, heart heavy. It was still early, the kind of gray morning where the light doesn't know if it wants to stay or leave. I stepped quietly into the hallway and followed the noise like it was a thread, unraveling from the center of my life. She was in the study. My daughter, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through the filing cabinet like she was working in an archive. Folders lay open around her, their contents spilling onto the rug I once stitched by hand during long winter evenings. She didn't see me at first. Her phone was propped up beside her, playing soft instrumental music, the kind used in waiting rooms and elevators. I watched for a while, not hiding, just unnoticed. When she finally looked up, she didn't flinch. She smiled. Good morning. I thought I'd get a head start on organizing. You've got papers in here going back to 1984. I said nothing. She held up one folder, shaking her head gently. This one's just old utility bills. We can toss these, right? I crossed the room and took the folder from her hands. Inside were receipts, yes, but not just bills. I flipped through them, my eyes scanning dates and scribbles in his handwriting. One was a receipt for the hospital bill when she broke her wrist at age 7. Another was a thank you note from the local charity we donated to every Christmas, and tucked at the very back a small photo her in pigtails, holding a balloon shaped like a dog. Not everything that looks like garbage is garbage, I said. My voice was calm, but the tremor in my fingers betrayed me. She shrugged. Well, we can't keep everything, Mom. Sentiment isn't a filing system. That sentence settled over me like ash, dry, light, smothering. I left her there and went to make tea. Boiling water calms me, it always has. The whistle of the kettle is the only kind of scream I've ever allowed myself in this house. By the time she came into the kitchen, the mug was cooling in my hands. She sat down across from me, her eyes scanning my face like she was studying the clouds before a storm. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I just want to help you know," she added quickly. "I'm trying to take some of the weight off your shoulders." "My shoulders are fine," I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't have to do this all alone." But I wasn't alone, not in the way she meant. I had every version of myself with me, every younger woman I used to be, every decision that kept this house standing, every sacrifice that put shoes on her feet and college books in her hands. I was never alone in this place, but I was unseen. She brought up the lawyer again that afternoon, said she'd been in touch, said he could help me streamline things, said that word like it was a gift, not a warning. "He's very kind," she said, "very patient, and he's got experience with estates like this." I asked her gently if she thought I was dying. She froze, then laughed too loudly. No, of course not. I just think it's good to have a plan, to be proactive." I nodded, letting the silence answer her for me. That evening, I went into the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. The ladder creaked like an old man trying to stand, and the air was thick with dust and memory. I opened the small window to let in some breath, then sat down among the boxes. Old baby clothes, my wedding veil, the red scarf he bought me in Venice, a shoebox filled with ticket stubs and birthday cards. I opened each one like I was rereading the chapters of a book I never wanted to finish, and I cried, not loudly, just enough to make space for the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. It was up there under a box labeled Xmas that I found the envelope, his handwriting, faded ink, my name. Inside was a letter, one I'd forgotten, or perhaps one he had hidden for just such a moment. "My love. If you're reading this, I'm not far, just out of sight. I know how you worry. I know how much you hold without showing it. Don't let them take what we built. You gave your life to this home, to our family. You gave everything. Let the next chapter be yours. Please, choose peace, not obligation. Love always, H." I folded the letter carefully and held it to my chest. I could almost hear his voice again just behind the stillness, that soft baritone he reserved only for me. And that's when I knew, not just what I had to do, but that I could do it. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need to argue or explain. My story wasn't over. It was simply turning a page, and I was going to write the rest in ink they couldn't erase. The attic's silence followed me down the ladder, clinging to my clothes like the scent of dust and cedar. I held his letter in my hand all the way to the bedroom, fingers curled tightly around it like it might disappear if I let go. I didn't cry again. The tears had already carved their path, and what remained now was something colder, calmer. like the moment just before a storm breaks, when the birds go silent, and even the wind holds its breath. Downstairs, the voices were louder. Laughter bounced off the walls, as if nothing had changed, as if my grief wasn't still drying in the corners of the house. My daughter was holding court in the living room, glass of wine in one hand, legs tucked under her on the couch, like she was already settled in for good. Her husband scrolled on his phone. A neighbor had come by with a casserole, and they were talking about paint colors for the dining room. Paint. They were talking about paint. As if the bones of this house weren't still warm from the man I had buried 3 days ago, as if my memories could be scraped off the walls like old wallpaper. I stood there at the edge of the room and no one looked up. I was invisible, a ghost with breath. So I turned around and walked into his study. Our study really, but it had always been his in spirit. The oak desk worn smooth where his elbows rested, the lamp with the crooked shade he refused to replace, and the drawer that squeaked no matter how carefully you opened it. I opened it now. Inside were the documents he kept tucked away, the deed, the will, the insurance paperwork. I laid them all out in rows like cards on a table, reading not as a widow, but as a woman who had waited too long to be seen. And I realized something. His will was outdated. Not illegal, just old. Before the cancer. Before her distance. Before the version of my daughter who now wandered these halls as if she were already measuring them for new curtains. He hadn't changed it because he trusted her. He trusted us. But she had changed, quietly in ways that only grief could bring to the surface. I gathered the documents and made a call. The lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice steady, respectful. I told him I needed to update a few things. I asked for a private meeting, no family involved, just me. He didn't ask why. He knew. The appointment was set for Friday. That gave me 2 days. 2 days of smiling politely while they measured their future against the backdrop of my past. The next morning, I pretended. I let her talk to me over coffee. Let her suggest a new doctor for my checkups. Let her casually mention the idea of moving some of the antiques into storage just for now. I smiled, nodded, asked about the weather. I was pliable, harmless, everything she hoped I would be. But that night I sat with my journal, the same one I'd kept since my 40th birthday. Every page a map of small triumphs, long nights, hidden heartbreaks. I flipped through it slowly, then began to write again. Today I remembered who I was. Not someone's mother, not someone's widow, just me. And that will have to be enough. It was the first thing I had written in weeks. The next day I baked. Cinnamon bread, just like he liked it. The smell filled the house, and for a brief trembling moment, I imagined him walking into the kitchen saying, "You always make it better than the bakery." I smiled at the memory and let it sit with me warm and thick. My daughter came in, drawn by the scent. "Wow, you're baking," she said, surprised. "I wanted to," I replied, not looking up. She hovered near the counter. "Do you remember the recipe?" she asked, laughing gently like it was a joke. I turned to her flour still on my hands. "I remember everything." She didn't know what to say to that. I cut her a slice, watched her eat it, eyes flicking from mine to the floor, suddenly unsure of the lines she thought had been drawn in permanent ink. After she left the room, I opened the drawer in the hallway console. Tucked inside were the spare keys to the house, the safe, the storage unit we once rented when the roof was being repaired. I counted them. Some were missing. I knew she had taken copies. So that night I changed the locks. Quietly. With the help of the neighbor's son, who still remembered the time I patched up his scraped knee after he fell off his bike in our driveway. He didn't ask questions, just smiled and said, "You let me know if you ever need anything else, okay?" I thanked him, tucked the new keys into my pocket, and closed the door behind him. The house felt different after that. Lighter. Mine again. And I knew deep in the softest part of my belly that when I walked into that lawyer's office the next day, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't apologize. Because what they had taken from me wasn't tangible. It was something worse. They had stolen the version of me who doubted herself. And I wasn't letting her back in. It was late. The kind of late when the house stops pretending and settles into its own skin. The floors no longer creaked with footsteps. They sighed low and tired, like the walls themselves had finally exhaled. I sat in the armchair he used to claim after dinner, the one by the window, where the light from the street lamp spilled in just enough to read by. I hadn't sat there since he passed. It had felt too sacred. Too close to pretending he might still walk in and tell me to scoot over. But tonight, it didn't feel like I was stealing something. It felt like I was reclaiming it. My hands rested in my lap, folded like they had been the day of the funeral. I could still remember the weight of the silence around his grave. But tonight, a different silence pressed against me, thicker, denser. The silence of betrayal that doesn't come like thunder, but in slow drips. A silence that accumulates in corners, that builds until the air itself feels unbreathable. That evening at dinner, I had caught them whispering again, in the hallway. Her husband said, "She'll be easier to convince once we have the paperwork started." And she had nodded like it was nothing, like I was a piece of land to be purchased rather than a person who had built their world. I think it was the nod that broke something in me. Not the words. Not even the plan. Just the ease. The way she slipped into this role, as if this house, this life had simply become hers by default, as if my grief had triggered a countdown to her inheritance. But what they didn't realize, what they had never realized, is that I had been watching, listening. Not just this week, but for years, in the way she called less often, in how she sighed when I needed help, in the way her voice changed around others, brighter, more polished, like I was something to be embarrassed by. She hadn't just drifted from me. She had rerouted herself entirely. That realization didn't come with anger, not immediately. It came with grief, a second grief, layered beneath the first, not just for the husband I lost, but for the daughter I had once known, the child who used to run barefoot through the hallway, giggling and clumsy, asking me to braid her hair before school. She had become someone I could no longer find in the noise. I rose from the chair, slowly feeling my joints resist, and walked to the kitchen. The teacup she had left on the counter still held the faint outline of her lipstick on the rim. I stared at it for a long time, then I washed it. Not because I had to, because I needed to. It felt like cleansing something deeper. I sat at the table with the deed in front of me, the original, not the copies she thought she had tucked away safely in her folder of plans. I had made sure she didn't find this one. My fingers moved to the envelope I had prepared, already sealed, already addressed to the lawyer. Inside the updated documents, the new directives, the shift that would change everything. No more assumptions. No more quiet thefts in the name of help. I wasn't leaving her with nothing. I was leaving her with the truth. And sometimes that's the heaviest thing of all. Before bed, I passed her in the hallway. She looked up from her phone just long enough to say, "Don't forget we're meeting with the appraiser next week." "I won't forget," I said. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. She blinked, as if hearing something unfamiliar in my voice, something firm. She didn't ask what I meant. She should have. That night, I lay in bed under the quilt we'd shared for decades. The fan hummed overhead, and outside the wind rustled the garden leaves like they were whispering my name. I thought of him, not the final version, not the one in the hospital gown, but the one who used to leave little notes in my coat pocket when I was having a hard week, the one who once said, "You are the keeper of this house, not just the walls, but the spirit." I closed my eyes and whispered into the pillow I remember, and I meant it. Morning would come soon enough, and with it the moment I would quietly take everything back that had been slipping through my fingers. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth and dignity, and that soft, slow power that comes when a woman remembers she still has the final word. The sky was pale with morning when I stepped outside, wrapped in the old shawl he gave me on our last Christmas together. The air was crisp and damp, the kind that clung to your skin and made everything feel a little more real. I stood on the front porch for a long time, my hand resting on the wooden railing he had sanded smooth himself. I watched the light change the way it slid over the hedges and softened the corners of the world, and I thought, this is mine, still mine. Inside the house was quiet, unnaturally so. My daughter and her husband had gone out early off to a quick meeting, she had said, with that distracted tone she now wore like perfume. I knew what the meeting was, knew who it was with. The lawyer she had chosen not knowing, I had already called my own. The one who would explain gently. I'm sure that she had no claim to what she was already carving up like roast chicken. The envelope sat in my handbag, tucked beside a pen and a handkerchief I didn't expect to need. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the sealed flap, and slid it into my coat pocket. Then I locked the front door behind me, not out of fear, out of finality. The drive to the lawyer's office was slow. I took the long way, winding through the streets I'd driven 1,000 times, past the school where she once waved at me from the swing set, past the diner where he and I used to sit in the booth by the window and share a plate of fries long after our youth had passed, past the church where we were married, where she was baptized, where every version of our family once gathered with smiles that meant something. I parked and walked the short path to the office door, my steps slow but steady. Inside, the assistant smiled kindly. "He's expecting you," she said, and I nodded, settling into a chair that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old upholstery. When I stepped into the lawyer's office, I didn't hesitate. I shook his hand, sat down, and laid the envelope between us. "I've made my decision," I said. He looked at me, no pity. No condescension, just that quiet professionalism I had come to respect. He opened the envelope, scanned the papers, then looked back at me. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain." What we discussed next took less than an hour. The amendments, the trust, the allocations, the clause that made it all airtight. He made a few notes, suggested a few options, and when it was all said and done, I signed my name at the bottom of the last page. Not with a trembling hand, with a steady one. I left the office lighter. Not euphoric, this wasn't joy. It was a kind of stillness, a knowing, like setting something down after carrying it for far too long. When I arrived back home, the house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. This one held space for me, like it had been waiting. She came back mid-afternoon, the front door clicking open with the same easy confidence that had begun to grate like sandpaper on my skin. She walked in with 2 coffee cups, handed one to me without asking if I even wanted it. "Good news," she said, settling on the couch. "He says everything's pretty straightforward. The house is in great condition, and I've already got a contact at a local agency that handles estate transitions. They'll make everything smooth." I didn't answer right away. I just sipped the coffee she gave me now, bitter on my tongue. I set it down gently on the side table and looked her in the eye. "I already met with my lawyer," I said. This morning. Her smile faltered. What? I updated everything. The house, the will, all of it. There was a pause, a silence so thick it changed the air between us. She set her cup down with a soft clink. Mom, why would you do that without talking to me first? Because I knew exactly what you'd say. Her eyes narrowed confusion, quickly tilting towards something else. You're being unfair. No, I've been quiet. That's different. She stood arms crossed. So what now? You're just going to cut me out? I looked at her, really looked, and I felt no hate, no rage, just a long, soft sorrow, like watching a favorite tree lose all its leaves knowing it won't bloom again. I'm not cutting you out, I said. I'm setting a boundary, one I should have set years ago. Her face twisted into something I didn't recognize. You don't belong in that house anymore. You can't keep living like this. I stood too slowly. Maybe I don't belong in your version of this family, but this house, this life, it still remembers me. She turned and walked upstairs without another word, and I let her go. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked the halls of my home like a woman walking through memory. Each room still whispered his name. Each wall still held my laughter, my grief, my becoming. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel erased. I felt rooted. The morning after that conversation, the house felt different. Not quieter I was used to, but emptier. Like something had been cleared out without my permission. I moved through it slowly as though the air itself might give away some secret I hadn't noticed the night before. There was no trace of her downstairs. No note, no plate on the counter. No sound from upstairs. Just silence. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened for any hint of movement. Nothing. I climbed the steps one by one, not rushing, not fearing. I knocked on the guest room door once lightly, then opened it. The bed was made. The bags were gone. She had left. No goodbye, no explanation, just vanished like smoke after a match dies out. For a moment I didn't move. I stood there with one hand on the doorframe, taking in the absence. The bedspread pulled tight. The folded towel she didn't use, the space where her shoes had been by the closet. It was as if she had never been there at all, just a trace of perfume lingering in the room like a question. Downstairs I found my coffee mug exactly where I had left it the night before. I warmed it again and sat at the kitchen table watching steam rise like a soft signal of return. My hands were still, but my mind wasn't. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or sadness. Maybe both. Maybe neither. She hadn't taken anything, at least not anything I could see, but the emotional inventory was harder to tally. What she had taken without even realizing it was a version of trust, the last thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, she had still seen me as her mother, and not a stepping stone to something she thought she deserved. I stood and wandered into the den. It was there, tucked between two thick hardcover books, that I found what she had left behind. A folder, thick, sloppy, with papers. Her notes, her lists, her plans. She had labeled it Transition Strategy. I sat down with it, took my time. There were printouts of retirement homes, condos, legal guides to elder transitions, a draft of a letter to the family about next steps. There were even numbers scribbled in the margins, calculations for resale value renovation estimates. One page had my name at the top. She had written, Mom, needs help understanding long-term value. Use gentle tone, underlined. It was like reading a business pitch about my own life. And right there, under a sticky note half falling off the page, I saw the sentence that landed with the weight of a stone in water. She doesn't belong in that house anymore. I pressed my hand against my chest, half hoping to quiet the sudden wild beating inside. I had already known it somewhere in my bones, but seeing it in ink, seeing those words staring back at me felt like a funeral all over again. Not for him, for what we used to be. She didn't think I belonged here. Not in the kitchen where I had bandaged her scraped knees. Not in the living room where she once danced in a tutu to an off-key radio. Not in the garden where I planted marigolds for her first birthday. She didn't see those things when she looked around. She just saw space. I folded the folder shut and placed it neatly in the desk drawer, not out of respect, but out of finality. If she came back for it, she would find it untouched, and if she didn't, then that would be answer enough. That afternoon, I went to the back of the closet and pulled out the small wooden box, the one where I kept things too private for drawers. Inside was the photo of us on her graduation day. Her cap crooked her lipstick too bright. I was holding her hand, then both of us beaming, unaware of the slow drift already beginning. I stared at it a long time. Then I placed it face down in the box and closed the lid. Not with anger, with mourning. By sunset, I found myself in the garden again. The last petals were falling from the rose bush. The breeze tugged at the hem of my sweater, and the light turned gold, then orange, then that deep blue that lets you know the day is done. I sat on the stone bench he had built with his own hands, the one under the arch of vines, and I spoke aloud, not loudly, just enough for the air to catch it. She's gone. The garden didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The wind kept moving. The leaves kept whispering. The earth kept holding me up. And in that silence, I realized something. Belonging wasn't something someone else gave you. It wasn't written in a will or granted through a title. It was in the way your footsteps remembered the creak of the floorboards, in the way the walls knew the echo of your voice, in the way a garden grew best under your hands. She didn't think I belonged here, but the house disagreed, and so did I. The next few days passed like fog, slow, gray, and quiet, in a way that felt both merciful and strange. I had expected more from her departure. A phone call, perhaps, or a message with flimsy explanations and a line about needing time to think. But there was nothing. No knock on the door, no voice on the other end of the line. Just absence. She left as easily as one leaves a room, and the silence she left behind filled the house like water in a vase. I didn't tell anyone. Not the neighbors, not my sister, not even the woman from church who had taken to calling every Sunday like clockwork. I kept it close, let it settle. I walked through the house like it was breathing again, stretching in her absence, pulling back into its old rhythm. The radio worked its way back into my mornings. The kettle sang louder. I let the silence speak without having to interpret it anymore. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt returned to myself. Still, there were little reminders. The perfume that clung to the guest pillows, a coffee spoon left in the sink, the mark her suitcase wheels had left on the floor of the hallway. They weren't painful, not like before. They were just remnants, echoes that faded a little more each day. I didn't rush to erase them. Letting go isn't always about scrubbing the evidence. Sometimes it's about letting the ghost of things pass on their own. On the fourth morning, I stood in the doorway of what used to be her bedroom, not the guest room, her childhood room. I hadn't touched it in years. The door had remained closed through most of the years after she moved out, except for the occasional holiday visit, when she would spend 10 minutes inside before gravitating to the more modern comforts of a hotel. I opened the door. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but beneath it something sweeter lingered, vanilla lotion maybe, or the perfume she wore in high school. The wallpaper was still faded pink, curling slightly at the corners. The desk held a stack of notebooks with childish handwriting, and the shelves were lined with trophies and old photos in mismatched frames. I moved through it slowly. A museum to a girl I remembered so vividly, a girl who used to cry when I left her room at bedtime, who once held my hand on the first day of kindergarten like it was a lifeline, a girl who couldn't sleep without the nightlight shaped like a moon. That girl felt impossibly far away now, as if she had vanished entirely, and in her place stood a woman who couldn't see me for anything but an obstacle. I sat on her old bed, the springs creaking familiarly beneath me, and reached for the middle drawer in the desk. Inside I found a crumpled sheet of notebook paper, folded tightly, edges worn. I opened it slowly. It was a note she had written me maybe at 10 or 11 years old. The handwriting was big and uneven. Mom, when I grow up, I want to buy you a big house and make you tea every morning. You'll never have to clean or worry again. You'll just read and plant flowers and be happy every day. Love, your daughter. I pressed the paper to my chest, not to cry over it, but to hold on to something that had once been true. Children make promises in purity. Life bends them in strange ways. I didn't know when that dream of hers had changed, when it had turned from wanting to care for me to wanting what I had. I refolded the note carefully and slid it into my pocket. Then I closed the drawer and stood. I didn't feel bitterness, just clarity. That child, the one who wrote that note, she had once been my home, but I could no longer live in who she used to be, and she clearly could no longer see me as anything other than a worn-out shadow of herself. In the garden that afternoon, I trimmed the rosebush, careful with each cut. The last few blooms had faded, and it was time to make space for the new. I thought about how pruning isn't destruction, it's preparation. You remove what no longer serves, not because you don't love it, but because you do. Because you want it to grow stronger, more beautiful next season. I wiped my hands on my apron and stood back, admiring the shape of it. Smaller, neater, still very much alive. I went back inside and pulled the updated papers from the drawer, what the lawyer had finalized, and sent back to me. The envelope was thick, but not intimidating. Inside it was my choice laid out in precise language. My home protected, my wishes sealed, my silence broken only in writing. I didn't tell her what I had done. I didn't call to explain, because this time my life didn't need to pass through her approval. This time I had written the ending before they could draft a beginning. That night, as I sat once more in his old chair, I felt something shift. The house didn't feel like a waiting room anymore. It felt like a place I was allowed to keep breathing. And that was more than enough. The days continued in a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd missed. Not busy, not bustling, just steady. I woke when the light touched the curtains, not when voices pulled me from sleep. I made breakfast. For one, set the table with my favorite dish, not the guest set. We kept hidden in the back cabinet for special occasions. I sat by the window and let the sunlight paint patterns on the floor. Patterns I used to rush past, too busy making space for everyone else's chaos. I didn't hear from her. Not a call, not a message. It was as if her absence had been intentional, a line drawn with finality, not hesitation. And strangely, I didn't reach for the phone either. I didn't chase. I didn't soothe. I didn't patch the tear she left behind. Because this time I didn't want to mend something that had split so cleanly. Instead, I turned inward. I pulled out the photo albums, the real ones, not the ones made for display. These were heavy, cracked at the spines, full of crooked smiles, and birthday hats' hands, clasped across generations. And there she was, in so many of them. My little girl, all toothy grins and grass-stained knees, her arms wrapped around a puppy, her cheeks red from crying after she lost her first balloon, her laughter caught mid-breath. I touched each page like a wound. There was grief in those photos, but not just for her, for me too. The woman I used to be, the one who gave and gave, who softened herself so thoroughly she forgot she had edges. The one who believed that love meant sacrifice without return. I saw her in those photos, always in the background, holding the camera, carrying the cake, cleaning the mess no one else noticed. I had loved being a mother. I still did. But I had not loved being forgotten. Later that afternoon, I went to the safe tucked behind the bookshelf. The code still came to my fingers out of muscle memory. Inside were documents, yes, but also a small wooden box, the last gift he ever gave me before he got too weak to carve. It was simple, smooth, a perfect square. Inside a necklace, a single gold locket on a chain. No inscription. Just the warmth of his hands still somehow there in the grain. I had never worn it. It felt too final at the time, like a goodbye, before I was ready to say it. But now I opened the clasp and placed it around my neck. It sat just above my heart, where all the things I hadn't said lived quietly waiting to be named. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I left the house. Not to shop, not to run errands. Just to walk. The sidewalk felt different beneath my shoes, like the earth itself had changed. But really, it was me. I wasn't rushing to meet someone's needs. I wasn't planning a list in my head. I wasn't navigating my worth through usefulness. I just walked. Down the street, through the park, past the school where the children's laughter rose like birdsong over the fence. I watched a woman my daughter's age pushing a stroller, her face tired and tender, and I felt no bitterness, only the memory of my own steps once so similar. The weight of a child on my hip, the ache in my back that didn't matter because love always carried you farther than exhaustion. At the edge of the park was a bench. I sat, closed my eyes, let the air move through my lungs like forgiveness. That's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out slowly, expecting maybe a message from the pharmacy or a reminder for a checkup I'd forgotten. But no, it was her. Just a single message. "We need to talk. I didn't mean for things to go this way." I stared at the words. Read them once, twice. And then I locked the screen and placed the phone face down in my lap. Because what I needed wasn't a conversation. It wasn't an apology made of half regret and rewrites. What I needed was space. Room to decide whether talking would heal or simply reopen what had already scarred. I sat there until the light began to shift, until the birds began to quiet, and the air took on the scent of coming rain. Then I walked home, not toward her, toward myself. Because not every bond deserves repair. Some deserve peace. Some deserve silence. And I was finally beginning to understand the difference. The next morning, I didn't open her message again. I left it untouched, sitting quietly in my inbox, like a book I'd decided not to finish, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. There are words that arrive too late, words that come only after the listener has gone somewhere deeper, quieter, where explanations can't reach. That's where I was now, not angry, just still. I moved through the house like I was preparing it not to leave, but to live in it differently, more fully, without bracing for footsteps that didn't belong to me. I opened windows I hadn't cracked in months, letting air rush in like an old friend. I rearranged the living room just slightly, shifting the armchair closer to the bookshelf. I set a fresh vase of lilacs on the dining table. He used to bring me lilacs, cutting them carefully from the bush in the backyard, saying they smelled like promises kept. For lunch, I cooked something simple, just for me, not enough to share. That felt important. While the soup simmered, I found myself in the garage. It still held the shadows of his presence. The toolbox with everything labeled, the rack of gardening tools with duct tape around the handles from years of use. I touched them lightly, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. Gratitude, not grief. I pulled out a wooden crate from the shelf, one we hadn't opened in years. Inside were old journals, maps from road trips, and a stack of cassette tapes labeled in his neat, slanted handwriting Sunday mix for us. I brought them inside. That afternoon, I listened to one, found an old player in the hall closet, and watched the spools spin slowly as the music filled the room. Fleetwood Mac, Otis Redding, Carly Simon, the music of slow Sundays and soft forgiveness. I sat in his chair, eyes closed, letting the sound fill every ache I hadn't known how to name. I wasn't waiting for her anymore. Not for the door to open, not for footsteps in the hallway, not for a sudden apology that would glue the broken pieces back together. Because I'd stopped needing her to understand. Some things are too quiet to explain to someone who only listens when you raise your voice. And I wasn't raising mine anymore. That evening, a letter arrived in the mail. Not hers, she wouldn't send one, but from the lawyer. Final confirmation. All signatures in place, trust accounts finalized, inheritance redirected to causes I chose. Organizations that fed hungry mouths housed mothers like I once was, cared for aging women left behind by their children. Quiet acts of love, my legacy now written not in what I gave away to those who expected it, but in what I gave to those who never asked. The house was mine. The silence was mine. The ending mine. I folded the letter and tucked it beside his in the drawer like bookends on the story we'd built. And I felt something I hadn't in weeks, maybe months. Freedom. Not the kind you celebrate with firecrackers and champagne. The quieter kind. The kind that settles in your bones like warm tea, that lets you sleep without armor. That lets you breathe without planning your next defense. The next day, I called the locksmith again. Not for the front door, for the safe. I changed the combination, chose a new code, one only I would remember, a date that meant nothing to anyone else. Not our anniversary, not her birthday, just a quiet day in spring, the day I planted roses, and finally stopped asking what else I could have done. Later that week, I found the strength to do something harder than any legal revision. I walked into her old room with a cardboard box. And I packed. Not angrily, not like erasing her, but with intention. A slow acknowledgement that she wouldn't be coming back as the girl I'd raised. That this space didn't need to hold its breath any longer. I folded the shirts she left behind, the framed photo of her from prom, the book she once read, so many times, the spine split. I wrapped each thing in tissue as if to say I remember, and I still choose to move forward. At the bottom of the closet, I found a shoebox filled with her old-school drawings, crayon portraits of me and Mommy, houses with smiling windows, stick figures with big hearts. I kept those, not for her, for me. A reminder that love once lived here. And though it no longer lived in her, it had not died in me. That night, I placed the box by the front door, and I slept better than I had in weeks. There's a kind of silence that grows roots. That was what my house had become, a place no longer paused, but grounded. Every sound was deliberate. Now the creak of the floor beneath my morning steps, the drip of the faucet, I kept forgetting to fix the rustle of wind against the window panes. Nothing startled me anymore. Nothing rushed in uninvited. and for the first time in a long while, I felt the house breathing with me, not over me. I spent that morning tending the garden fingers buried deep in the soil, tugging out weeds with a kind of reverence. There's something sacred about working with dirt. It reminds you that everything eventually returns to the earth, even the hard things, even the memories that once bruised you. I moved slowly along the rows, whispering names of the plants, as if they were old friends: lavender, rosemary, marigold. The sun warmed the back of my neck, and the breeze brought with it the scent of the rosemary he used to snip for my roasted chicken. When I stood to stretch my back, I saw it, her car, parked at the curb. She hadn't called. She hadn't written again. Just arrived, as if this place still opened itself to her without question. I didn't move. She stepped out, carefully dressed, hair pulled back, sunglasses pushed up on her head. She stood at the gate like she was waiting for something. My permission, maybe. But I didn't offer it. Eventually, she pushed the gate open and stepped into the yard. "Hi," she said softly, stopping a few paces from me. I nodded, brushing soil from my palms, but said nothing. I thought maybe we could talk." I looked at her. She looked older than I remembered, not just in age, but in the way her eyes moved slower, heavier. "About what I asked." She swallowed. "About everything." That wasn't specific. That was a lifeboat thrown into water, long after the ship had sunk. "I read your message," I said, and I chose not to respond. She looked down, nodding like she expected that. I deserve that, I know. The air between us thickened with the weight of all the things we'd never said right. She shifted her feet, searching for something to lean on, but there was nothing. No more softness to stand on. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice thin. "I just thought I was doing what was best." For who I asked, not with anger, but with a steady kind of sorrow. She didn't answer. "I came to help Mom. I thought you needed—" "What you thought I needed," I interrupted, "was a house you could reshape to your liking, a life you could file and number, and hand off to a stranger with a clipboard. You didn't come to help. You came to take over." Her jaw clenched, then relaxed. I didn't know I was doing that. "No," I said. "You didn't want to know." She wiped at her eyes quickly, almost angrily, like the tears embarrassed her. I let her cry. I didn't reach out. She hadn't earned that comfort yet. "I found the folder," I said. "Your plans, your numbers, your line about me not belonging here." She flinched, truly flinched. That wasn't meant the way it sounded. "But you wrote it." "I didn't mean—" "You did," I said gently, "and that's the part that matters." There was a long pause then. A breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, and a bird chirped. Once, then fell silent again. Everything held still while she stood there, blinking against sunlight. She didn't expect to feel so sharp. "I wanted to fix it," she whispered. "I'm not something to be fixed." She nodded. "I know that now." We stood in the garden together, the silence no longer angry but tired. There was no apology big enough to undo what she'd written, what she'd said, what she'd quietly arranged. And I wasn't asking for one. I wasn't interested in rewinding. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," I said. "On you." "I still want to be in your life," she said. "I want to learn how to do better." "Then start by learning how to wait." She looked confused. "You don't get to come back and pick up where we left off. You don't get to erase the weeks of silence with a drive and a sorry. If you want to stay, you stay as a visitor, not as someone entitled. You ask before entering. You offer before assuming. You don't call it helping when it's about control." She nodded slowly. "Okay." I turned back to the garden. The weeds weren't finished yet. The dirt still needed tending, and I didn't stop her when she stepped back toward the gate. "I'll wait," she said softly. However long it takes. I didn't respond. Not yet. But that night when I passed by the window, I saw her car still parked outside. She hadn't driven off in anger. She sat there, head bowed, waiting. And I stood there inside the house she once tried to take from me, feeling for the first time like the roots I'd planted had finally held. She didn't come back the next day, or the one after that. The car was gone by morning, leaving only tire tracks in the gravel and a slight bend in the gate hinge where it hadn't quite closed behind her. But the air still held her shape faint as breath on a mirror. Her absence felt like a bruise, not fresh but deep, something I'd feel when the weather changed, when the air turned colder, when my hands ached more than usual in the mornings. I didn't call her, didn't ask where she'd gone. I just moved through my days like I had before, steady, purposeful quiet. Each task I completed, alone taking out the trash, changing the linens, making my soup from scratch, was a quiet affirmation of what I still had, of what I had always had, myself. I spent more time outside. I found that if I stayed long enough in the garden, the past softened. The roses were just stems now, but they still had life tucked inside, waiting for the next season. I pulled weeds with care, as if they too were old friends who had overstayed their welcome. I swept the porch every morning. I counted the crows that perched on the fence post near the mailbox. One afternoon, I walked into the town center, something I hadn't done in weeks. I wore my blue coat, the one he used to call my storm ski coat, and a scarf tucked under my chin. I visited the florist and bought myself lilies. I stopped at the post office just to check, and there it was. An envelope. Her handwriting. I carried it home like it might break, set it on the table, made tea before opening it. The letter was short, no long explanations, no begging. Mom, I've been sitting with everything you said, and everything I said too. I can't undo what I've done, and I won't try to overwrite it. But I'm not disappearing. Not again. I'll come when you ask. I'll listen when you speak. I'll wait if that's what it takes. I just hope someday we can sit at the same table again, not as mother and daughter trying to prove something to each other, but just as two women trying to begin again. Love me. I read it twice. Then I tucked it into the same drawer where I kept his letters, not because it held the same weight, but because it too was part of the story now, a quieter chapter. Maybe the start of something small and real. But I wasn't ready to respond. Not yet. Instead, I returned to the task I had started that week, going through the attic not to purge, but to honor. I opened boxes filled with decades of being. Birthday cards, children's drawings, recipes written on the backs of bills. I found the scrapbook he made me when we first moved into the house. Each page had a photo, a scribbled note, sometimes just a dried leaf or receipt from some forgotten cafe. He had labeled the last page. And still, you're the heart of it all. I traced the words with my fingertip. I left the scrapbook open on the table. That night, I slept with the window open, letting the late autumn wind lift the curtains and breathe life into the room. I wore his sweater too big and slightly moth-eaten but warm, and I dreamed not of her, not of the things taken or betrayed, but of the house as it once was, alive with sound, with memory, with me. I woke to soft light and the distant hum of the neighbor's lawnmower, the ordinary things, the things that keep you grounded when grief tries to pull you apart. I brewed coffee, poured it into the chipped mug I refused to throw out. And I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she once told me I wasn't thinking clearly, the same table where I first nursed her through a fever, the same table where he used to rest his elbows and smile over his reading glasses. And for the first time, I didn't feel displaced in my own home. I belonged here, not because of what I'd defended, but because of what I had chosen to remember. Because this house wasn't made of walls and windows. It was made of love, of sacrifice, of silence and stubbornness and Sunday dinners. It was made of me. And no one, not even someone I once loved more than breath, could take that away. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I heard from her for months. The letter sat in the drawer, folded neatly beside the old ones from him aging quietly in the dark like something waiting to see if it had a future. I didn't reread it. I didn't throw it away either. It just stayed there like so many things in my life now unresolved, but peacefully still. Winter came slowly that year. The mornings cooled first, then the evenings. The garden faded gently into sleep, and I let it rest. I stopped pruning. I stopped tending. I let the leaves fall and didn't sweep them right away. There was comfort in allowing the world to soften on its own without interference. I understood now some things don't need fixing. They just need time. My days became smaller, but not empty. I baked more. I wrote in my journal nearly every evening. I lit candles in the kitchen when the sun went down too early. I let silence sit across from me at dinner and learned not to fill it with noise. I read poetry again, the old aching kind that knows what it means to wait to want to lose. I visited the library once a week and picked books by their titles alone. Sometimes I didn't even read them. I just liked the way they felt in my hands. The neighbors stopped asking about her. They'd say things like, "You've been looking stronger lately," or "I love what you've done with the garden." They didn't ask when she'd be visiting next. Maybe they saw it in my face that I was no longer waiting for her to remember me. One evening, as I poured myself a small glass of wine, I sat in his chair again. I'd started doing that more lately, not to pretend he was still here, but to remember that I still was. I held the glass, looked out the window at the garden now bare and honest in the moonlight. And I thought, this is enough. Not the scraps of what I hoped she'd become, not the ache of what I lost when she chose distance over love, but this quiet, this home, this life I had built with my own hands and heartbreak. And I knew if I left tomorrow, the house would still remember me. In the slant of morning light on the banister, in the soft squeak of the back door, in the scent of cinnamon that still clung to the oven. I didn't need to explain that to anyone. I didn't need to write a final letter or hold a family meeting. I didn't need to scream or beg, because I had done what many women never get the chance to do. I chose myself. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of long overdue recognition. I was never someone's possession. I was never an afterthought in my own story. I was always the spine of it, the bones beneath the house, the hands that held everything up even when no one noticed. And now I was finally living like I knew that to be true. I had no regret, only peace. And as I finished the last sip of wine, I whispered into the dark, thank you not to anyone in particular, but to all the versions of myself who had carried me here. To the girl who learned to stay silent. To the wife who gave everything. To the mother who waited too long. To the woman who finally stood up and said no more. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And I gave them silence. And in it I found peace. Now the days drift by more softly. I wake with no urgency, no looming conversation waiting to be had. The house hums with a kind of stillness that isn't lonely, just spacious. I move slowly, not because I'm weak, but because I choose to. I savor things now, the way the tea kettle sings the sound of the floor warming beneath my slippers, the sight of birds dancing just beyond the kitchen window. Sometimes I think of her, sometimes I don't. That too feels like healing. Because letting go isn't a single act. It's a series of gentle decisions to no longer reread old messages, to no longer hope someone becomes someone else, to stop waiting at the door with your heart in your hands. I learned that love doesn't always come back in the shape you gave it. Sometimes it folds, sometimes it fades, and sometimes it returns too late to be received. But peace comes quietly. It doesn't knock or explain itself. It just settles beside you like an old friend with nothing to prove. I don't know what comes next. Maybe she'll return, maybe not. Maybe forgiveness will sprout in its own season. Maybe it already has. But what matters now is this. I chose myself when no one else remembered to. And in this house, my house, that will always mean something. No plaque, no ceremony, no applause. Just silence. And in that silence, the soft sound of a life finally lived.